Hey, what is up, everybody? Platform Disciple here, and today I am going to be doing another card rework video, and the card that we're going to be talking about today is Exalted Firebrand, which is a card that I recently brought up in a different video where I was covering the buffs that were recently given to a whole number of cards, including Exalted Firebrand. Exalted Firebrand got 1 additional health, which unquestionably benefits the card, but I felt that this buff fell short of where I'd liked the card to be. And I do want to preface all of this by saying that adding an additional point of health is a much easier thing to do than reworking a card in the way that I'm going to lay out for a lot of these. And I also want to clarify that reworking cards in general, I don't think should be a priority for the game developers. I think it can be fun every once in a while, but anytime effort could be put towards trying to bring new players into the game, that should always happen instead of the kind of game designing, making new cards, reworking cards, balancing cards. I think those things are fun and important, but they're not important if you don't have people playing the game. So like what I'm getting at here is that you could rework 5 cards, but if that time could have been spent getting 5 new players into the game, that would be better. But it's not a simple trade-off. You can't just choose one or the other. And I get that the people working on the game may have a lot of experience with things like reworking and rebalancing cards or making new cards, and not as much experience with brand strategy. And I also want to clarify that the reason that I am making videos on these reworks is because they're entertaining and fun for me. And I don't think talking about brand strategy is going to be as interesting for people watching the video. So, that out of the way. I also want to kind of double back on what I said in the previous video, because there were a large number of comments I made because there were so many buffs. And because of that, some of the comments I made were hasty and more focused on just being entertaining throughout the long video. And that, with Exalted Firebrand in mind, led to me making comments that were hyperbolic and a little misleading. And I want to clarify some of the things related to that. And the first thing I want to address is that I said that Flame Dawn has a couple of really good 2-drops and that it makes the other 2-drops harder to justify. And I pointed my finger at Paladin of the Flame Dawn. This is a card that I've been highlighting a lot lately because I think it's very strong, and I think that maybe it could probably like lose 1 health and still be a 3 of in all of the decks that it already is in. And there's a lot of things that make Paladin the Flame Dawn strong, but I want to clarify here, if you nerf Paladin the Flame Dawn into oblivion, like completely removed the card from the game, that isn't going to make Exalted Firebrand playable. Because one of the big things that drives Paladin the Flame Dawn to be played so much is it is the most efficient, aggressive character that Flame Dawn has access to, and if it were to go away, Flame Dawn would then pick the next most efficient, costed, aggressive character, and that simply is not Exalted Firebrand, nor should it be. I think Exalted Firebrand should have a different niche. I also want to clarify that there's a lot of pressures in the game from the meta and the other cards that lead to whatever the most fast, aggressive, cost-efficient character existing being the one that is preferred for Flame Dawn. And right now that happens to be Paladin of the Flame Dawn. But that's not really Paladin the Flame Dawn's fault. It is because you need to have those high impact, immediate impact characters because of the fact that the game is relatively fast in matchups versus aggressive two aggressive decks. And if there's a control deck involved, then you don't expect your characters to stick on the board very long. So you really want those characters to give as much smack as they can as soon as possible to get as much of a return on investment on your resources spent as possible before those characters get cleared. So you, like, for example, when I talked about fast characters like Paladin the Flame Dawn, I referenced Siegebreaker quite a bit, if I can pull it up, which is a character that hypothetically would do more damage than Paladin of the Flame Dawn if it were allowed to kind of stay on the board longer. And that's just not the game that Infinity Wars is right now. And that's why you see Paladin of the Flame Dawn so much. Exalted Firebrand has additional problems beyond like Siegebreaker. Like, I think that if you removed Paladin the Flame Dawn from the game, you might see a little more Siegebreaker, but you're not going to see more Exalted Firebrand. And I think the reason for that is related to some of the things I've already brought up, but I do not feel like the game is in a place where there's a lot of transactions happening between attacking characters and defending characters. That if you're the control deck, you're probably clearing attacking characters with abilities for the most part. And if you are playing a more aggressive character-focused deck yourself, most of the time, it's going to be better to just try to match the pace of your opponent instead of be defending. Often I find that's the case. And the final kind of obstacle that Exalted Firebrand has is that for its effects to happen, or for you to care about it, it has to actually connect with a defender, and the defender that it's connecting with has to be a defender that has 8 or more health. And why 8? The answer is that you have a direct comparison in Knight of the Flame Dawn. This card can be played in all of the same decks and more because it is 1 purity. It has the same amount of health, and any time that Knight of the Flame Dawn could kill a defender, that is going to be better than just exhausting it, almost always. There are some cases where the defender is really massive, in which case Exalted Firebrand gets to explore its niche of exhausting that character and taking it out of the defense zone. But I don't think that happens that often. And even though it does happen, you're sacrificing that 3 damage that could be pressuring the enemy fortress or killing characters outright that are smaller. And all of that being said, Knight of the Flame Dawn is just not a card that gets played, nor really do I think it needs to be played. It's a vanilla kind of it's a character that exists as a litmus test, and I think that litmus test is one that Exalted Firebrand doesn't pass. So I think that Exalted Firebrand has a lot of things that are obstacles for it being a playable, viable card. There's a lot of things going on. There might be some argument that you have some synergies that Exalted Firebrand could tap into in cards like Proctal. But the nature of the game right now is such that I think that this archetype that Proctal is trying to tap into is not really supported enough, and I think even if it was supported, it probably won't be very good, because the type of deck that it wants to prey on is a deck that has characters that stick on the board and that you can exhaust and interact with, and I don't feel like that is as common these days, and matches are so fast that you'd rather just be more proactive with your game plan than futzing around with characters on the battlefield. I think futzing around with characters on the battlefield is cool, and I would like to see that become a bigger focus of the game design and balance at some point, but a lot of things need to happen for that to be possible, and it changing Exalted Firebrand or Paladin the Flame Dawn, neither of those are going to accomplish that. There's a lot of other things that would have to be changed. So, moving on, let's talk about how I would rework the card. And there's a lot of different things happening on Exalted Firebrand that I think could be adjusted to make the card more fun and interesting. So I want to acknowledge some things. One is I think characters like Exalted Firebrand that their niche involves the card dying should generally have a lower morale cost. Exalted Firebrand has an exceptionally high morale cost for a low-cost character whose entire niche revolves around him colliding with a really, really big character. So right off the bat, I think that if you're going to take a really conservative approach to adjusting Exalted Firebrand, I'd like to see his morale cost lower. My redesigns feature different morale costs across them because some of the redesigns are more dramatic and really kind of completely change the identity of the card. But I think in the current form of this card, I think it should have a lower morale cost. I think 4 is a great starting point. The next thing I want to identify is that the card is too flamed on purity. I think in general, higher purity cards need to be more specialized and they need to feel like the payoff for being more dedicated to a faction. For that reason, I think that a good way to test whether a card should have 2 purity is if it had 1 purity, would this card get played in more decks? If the answer to that is no, then you have a problem. And in this case, I think it's unclear. But that being said, I think because it is unclear, I think there's an argument to be had that making this card 1 purity would be harmless and probably better for the game. And I think that the 2 purity and 3 purity cards should be a little more flashy than this. That you do want your 2 purity and 3 purity cards to be playable. And if they aren't playable, make them 1 purity and see what happens. Because maybe somebody will be able to find synergies across other factions to make the card cool, and for the problem to fix itself. Last thing I want to acknowledge about this card is that it has a really interesting effect that would be more interesting if the effect could happen while the card was defending, because defenders get to transact with more characters per combat than attacking characters, that a defender can intercept enough more characters and Exalted Firebrand would be able to exhaust multiple characters per combat. This ability is a very powerful defensive ability, and this card has been ruled out of having that. And I don't know if that is because Flame Dawn has this history of being the super aggressive faction, but I don't think that it needs to be that way. I think that this card could be reduced in purity, reduced in morale cost, and could do something while it's defending. The same thing, as a matter of fact. And I think that would be cool. And I also think that defensive characters in general feel more anemic than offensive characters. So having another really good defensive character, even if it is Flamed On, I think could be fun and interesting for the game. Okay, so let's take a look at my redesigns, starting with one that kind of matches some of the things that I just said about like what would a very neutral redesign look like. This is not neutral. This is the neutral spicy. It's taking on some of those characteristics and going a little further. So again, reduced morale cost, reduced purity, has the effect work from the defense zone, but this has a couple other things going on for it. First of all, it has 2 less attack, and that is to compensate for the fact that it now has Flame Strike 2. That makes this card a much better standalone card, and it now fills a niche of being a very, very powerful anti-character character. It's really good at knocking other characters out of combat. It is good at killing other characters that are at a similar cost to it, and it is also good at temporarily neutralizing much better characters. This makes this card better in far more situations. I think that it's really exciting now, because now the card can be used in a lot of decks. But I don't think it's unreasonable because I don't think that it really does. I don't think it upsets the balance of how fast the aggro decks can be because it itself doesn't pressure for much damage, and you could just be running a higher damage character. Instead, I think this is a character that would thrive in a meta where characters are fighting other characters in combat. That might not be the current meta, but I think that this card becomes more interesting because its niche of being a character that thrives in that kind of meta becomes much more evident. And the last thing I want to say about this is kind of just touching on Flame Strike as a keyword ability. It is Flamedawn's signature keyword ability, but it actually doesn't appear on that many cards. And the cards that it does appear on, because they are really geared towards being aggressive characters, you have this awkward situation where Flame Strike doesn't get to do the thing that it's supposed to do a lot of times. Because if you have Kali and a bunch of other attacking characters in the assault zone, if a defensive character gets killed outright, then the Flame Strike doesn't get to happen. And defensive characters tend to get killed outright when you're playing an aggressive deck because you're piling all of your guys into the zone. On the other side of the spectrum, if a Flame Strike character is defending, it can apply Flame Strike to multiple attackers as opposed to one defending character. And that those attackers, because they only transact with one defender, might actually live, and that Flame Strike feels more relevant. So despite Flame Strike being a Flamedawn core ability, it's actually a really good defensive ability that we just don't get to see it happen often because of its association with Flamedawn. The other thing about Flame Strike is that Flame Strike supports the other component of Flamedawn, or one of the other components, which is stumble and exhaust effects. That when you stumble a character that has already been flame struck, then you get an extra turn for that damage to tick, which makes you get an extra bonus out of both of the cards. Stumble effects and Flame Strike effects synergize really well. And that is why I really like this redesign, because it marries these two effects together and creates a learning experience for a player where they now can see, oh, Flame Strike and Stumble effects work really well together. And you can stack more Stumble effects with Exalted Firebrand to better capitalize on the Flame Strike that it has. So that's enough about this card. Before we move on, I do want to clarify here that the reason I'm presenting so many of options is because I don't expect you to like or agree with all of these. And instead, they are intended to be conversation starters for you to say, oh, I really like this, but, and then you add whatever your feedback is. Or maybe you say, I really hate this. That's fine. That's why we have options. And that's also kind of the goal is for you to see these and hopefully have it inspire you to create your own iterations of Exalted Firebrand so that you can maybe understand, where does a card like this fit into the game and what would you like it to look like? So moving on, our next version of this card is very different. And because it's very different, this is focused more on being a 2 purity Flamedawn character. And it also has its morale cost back up because unlike the previous version of Exalted Firebrand, this one does not need to die in combat for it to achieve its purpose. Instead, this card is intended to be a foil to Fleeting Footman. And we're going to pull up Fleeting Footman here. Fleeting Footman is a character that retreats from combat when it enters combat with another character. And because of the nature of Fleeting Footman's ability, it usually ends up at the very end of the assault zone so that it can avoid as many defenders as possible so that it can actually get through for damage. This version of Exalted Firebrand has a similar effect where it retreats if it connects with an enemy character. Enemy defender, very important. But rather than trying to avoid that situation, that is the situation that you are trying to get into. it wants to connect with defenders, and it stumbles itself and the defender that it connects with. So it removes a defender from the defense zone every combat. So again, this is a type of character that would thrive more in a meta where there's more character-on-character interaction. Not sure if that's the case right now, but I think that the fact that it's a foil to Fleeting Footman is really interesting, and I do think that the ability to remove a defender every turn is very powerful and very Flame Dawn-y, which is why it's back at that 2 purity. Last thing I want to highlight about the card is, if you didn't catch this, it has the inverted stats of Fleeting Footman, so instead of 8 attack and 4 health, it has 4 attack and 8 health, just to kind of be that reference there. But again, very different card from the original, and you'll be noticing that about a lot of these designs, because I think that Exalted Firebrand, for it to be interesting, might need to look very different than how it looks today. And that leads us into our next option, which is practically a completely new card. It just happens to have the same name and use the same art. Again, 2 Flame Dawn purity. And again, 6 morale cost because it does not need to die for it to do its thing. And it is a 5/6 because I think this effect is very powerful, so it needs to have lower stats than your typical 2-drop. And what does it do? It is exhausting every character the turn it is deployed that was also deployed to the battlefield in the same turn. So charge characters, vigilance characters, and haste characters get stumbled when you play Exalted Firebrand. And the reference card here is Denial of Surprise. Denial of Surprise is a really cool card, and I'm going to bring up my gold stamped version. It's one of the only cards I have with a gold stamp. But this card is a Rework card that hoses charge, haste, and vigilance characters. And this version of Exalted Firebrand fills a similar niche. And I think this niche is a really needed niche in Infinity Wars, where I think that, as per the discussion I had in a previous video, that fast characters that immediately impact the board make up the majority of characters that are good in the game. And that's charge characters, haste characters, vigilance characters, but also deploy effects. And having a card that directly punishes those things without also being one of those things, I think is really nice. I think that having vigilance characters to balance out charge and haste characters is just like you're introducing more of the same problem. Whereas I think a card like Denial of Surprise, or in this case, the new Exalted Firebrand, helps address those things. And I also think it is very Flame Dawn-y because it lets you assert that you're the faction that is allowed to have charge characters, and because of that, you get to say no to other factions. It's more of a niche effect. It's probably not played in every deck, but I think that the skill involved in choosing when to play this and the utility gives it a very strong niche that it fills. Okay. And then our last card here has a new keyword on it, which I have created and might demand its own discussion at some point, but I wanted to introduce it here. And again, clarification here, people are allowed to give feedback. I don't expect you to just swallow this and say, oh, this keyword should be in the game, because maybe it shouldn't, but I think it's a cool keyword, and I'll explain why I think it's cool. So first I'm going to show a card that you're getting a bonus rework here, because this is the poster child for the new keyword. Pit Brawler. This is a card I used to really like, especially in Rift Run, because it is a character that has really high impact in those character versus character situations where you have two opposing battlefields colliding with each other, which I think is where Infinity Wars can be most exciting, and it also demands a lot more strategic thinking than just trying to spam out spontaneous combustions so much that nothing sticks to the board. I prefer for characters to be removed by other characters than by giant AoE removal effects. So Pit Brawler's really good at killing other characters, and he's only okay at dealing damage. The amount of damage he does to fortresses is comparable to a 4-drop. And I really like this, and I'd like to see this more often. As a matter of fact, the keyword that I'm presenting to you is an exaggerated version of this, where instead of just doing extra damage to characters, the keyword, which is called Brawler, makes characters that have that keyword, they do no damage to fortresses. They only do damage to other characters. And what's exciting about that is it allows you to give Brawler characters a bloated amount of stats, where they get to impact the game in a really dramatic way in character versus character impact, but they don't actually have a direct impact on the speed of the match. And that's something I'd like to see for Infinity Wars, is it slowing down and being more focused on character versus character combat. And I think the Brawler keyword might facilitate that, because now you have a character that can, as a defender, trade up, or as an attacker, pressure through really strong defenses. And I think that it'd be cool to see some Brawler characters in almost every faction, and they don't all have to be like this, where there's a lot of ways to play around with this keyword. And Exalted Firebrand, the final version of this, is one of those ways of playing around with the Brawler keyword. And I want to clarify here, the reason that it has the Brawler keyword is that it also has multi-strike too. And multi-strike is a really crazy effect, and on a 2-drop would be concerning, because it would allow that 2-drop to absorb buffs really, really effectively and push for an insane amount of damage very fast. But by putting the Brawler keyword on there, this character doesn't actually get to pressure the fortress more. As a matter of fact, it can't pressure the fortress at all, really. I also want to highlight here that this is a 3 purity version of Exalted Firebrand. I don't think that this card necessarily has to be 3 purity. I think it could be 2 purity, but I do think that this level of flash and uniqueness could be appropriate for a 3 purity Flamed on 2-drop. 2 purity might be better, but I just wanted to showcase a number of different things. All of these cards' numbers are subject to feedback, like maybe you think it needs more attack or health or less, and so on. But what's exciting about this card is that multi-strike, in combination with Exalted Firebrand's ability to exhaust characters, allows him to bonk 2 defenders out of the defense zone. And by having that Brawler effect on it, we can give this character a considerable amount of stats that might not be appropriate for something that usually has multi-strike. You probably wouldn't see multi-strike on a 2-cost character at all, let alone with 9 health associated with it. And again, I think that this helps play into some of the synergies that Flamed On has with stumbling characters, and I think this is a fun card. So that actually wraps up all of the redesigns that I have. And unlike the previous redesign video I did on Swarmer Broodlord, I don't think that reworking Exalted Firebrand actually adds that much play value to the game. And I also don't think that that these redesigns are necessarily slam dunks the way changing Swarmer Broodlord was. Because changing Swarmer Broodlord really affects like an entire archetype, and a whole collection of cards get to have more life breathed into them by changing Swarmer Broodlord, whereas changing Exalted Firebrand might be fun, but it doesn't actually do that much for the game, the health, and how fun it is. But I had fun making these redesigns, and I hope you had fun listening to me talk about them. So with that being said, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on these, and until next time, take it easy.